In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Gris de Payne. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. The swatch lies. It's much more blue than the majority of the writing that I get. And if that tone of blue is why you were looking at this ink and feeling that it was misnamed, the swatch isn't really giving you what the ink itself does. This gray is a nice neutral or slightly cool tone of gray with a great bit of shading and really good color variation throughout all of its writing. If I already didn't have a gray that was my go-to, then I would probably be going for this gray. Even though I tend to prefer my grays to look like pencil, and this one does not, I would probably go with this one because it is very nice on the page. I could live with the fact that it's not the gray that I normally turn to. Now, Payne's gray is an interesting color in itself for people that paint, because I know a lot of people that use Payne's gray mixing with different colors in order to create different types of shading or different, I'm going to call it darkness of different colors, opposed to using a black. It just has a nicer way of doing it. It, again, as a neutral or slightly cool tone, really on the page, it leaves you without feeling one way or another. You don't look at it and have any kind of emotional reaction to it. It's very just there, which I'm saying that here, meaning your ideas are just there and not tempting people to like it or dislike it because of the color that they see. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Sailor Pro Gear Slim Mini with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, it has no feather, it has no spread, it has tremendous shading throughout all of the writing and looks really good. It constantly draws your attention to the next word, which keeps you reading. It makes it something that's really good for me to think about as a note taker, because when what you're reading draws your eye to the next word, reading becomes much easier to do. The medium nib is darker than the fine as a majority. It has no feather. It has no spread. It maintains that great shading that the medium had the entire time. Really looking very good. The broad nib is a bit darker, quite a bit darker than the medium. It has no feather. It has no spread. It does shade incredibly well, but it gives a bit more of that cooler feeling from this color, which is rather interesting that it's doing that. Looking at the back of the page, we see almost no ghosting and no bleed through. To have a range of experience, all of the writing samples are done with a Jinhao 51A with a fine nib, a Parker Jotter with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Tornado with a broad nib, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, it has no feather, it has no spread. It does give little spots of shading. The noticeable thing for me here is the slight alteration to the color from this paper. I see the slightest blue lean, some of those blue undertones coming through here, which is interesting that it does it. That's one of the reasons that I say that Payne's gray is a slightly cool tone of, or slightly cool neutral. The medium is darker than the fine. It has no feather, no spread. It's shading very well. And strangely, we're not seeing the blue undertones that were coming through more in the fine. The broad nib is darker than the medium with no feather, no spread, really good shading throughout all of this writing. It looks really good here. And again, we're not getting the blue undertones that we got in the fine, which I really do find unusual that it even came through in the fine, making me think it's a reaction with the paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting and we got no bleeding. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get really good shading, but the thing I'm really looking at here is it's staying that gray, where on the Leuchtterm paper, we got a bit of a blue undertone with it. That is definitely not here. So it's maintaining its color profile. The medium nib is darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, really good shading, very nice on this paper. I think it's a great complement for cream tone paper because very often I'll see gray tones really change with cream paper. The broad nib is darker than the medium. It has no feather. It has no spread. It has really good shading. It's giving a really good neutral tone the whole way through. It's very nice to read, still drawing my eye to the next word as I'm reading through the sentences. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get minor ghosting and no bleeding. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, only a little bit of shading that occurs. This is a much lighter gray than we've been seeing on the other papers, but this paper is known to do that it makes the colors look a little more washed out. This is not a color that I would want to use from a fine nib on this paper. The medium is much darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread, pretty decent shading, not stand out all over the place shading. It's not enough shading that it's constantly drawing my eye to the next word as it did with some other papers. But it is looking nice here and giving some character. I find this much more pleasing to use as a note taker. The broad nib is darker than the medium with no feather, no spread. It shades better than the medium did, and even though it's quite a bit lighter than we've gotten on other papers, it's still very easy to read through everything that's here. I can see using this. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting and we get no bleeding. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman number 29. Here is Diatramentis Document Fog Gray. Here is Krishna Pencil. Here is Papier Plume Oyster Gray. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We get very nice shading throughout this. I think this looks very nice on here, although I think the tone of this gray is a little off with this paper. I'm not seeing the blue undertone so much as it just looks a little off. The medium nib is quite a bit darker than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. I hesitated because of where the dotted lines are on the G. It made me think it was feathering for a moment. No feather. It has no spread. It does shade quite a little bit. It's doing fairly well, which is pretty interesting. And most noticeably, where I made the mistake and crossed the word out, that'll be the point where I'm looking to see if this bleeds on the next page. The broad nib is much darker than the medium. It does have a tiny bit of feathering the whole way through that if you get kind of close, it gives it a slightly blurry look because the feathers are very tiny but very consistent. We are getting a little bit of spread, which I'm not enjoying on this paper. We are seeing some shading, but the feathering and spread makes me not too interested in it. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting, and where that error occurred and I crossed a word out, it did not bleed through and did not touch the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a green ink by Colorverse, their Season 1 Sea of Tranquility. Here is a shimmering turquoise by Diamine, their Enchanted Ocean. Here is a magenta ink by Noodlers, their Ottoman Rose. Here is an orange ink by Private Reserve, their Shoreline Gold. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get feathers, as we would expect. We get a tiny bit of spread, as we would expect. But we're going from a Japanese fine to a Western fine, so it's really not bad at all. That little bit of spread, that tiny bit of feathering. There are a couple of moments of shading, but nothing that really matters here. The medium nib is much darker than the fine. It does have tiny feathers all over it, as would be expected, as it has spread expected. It's not so much for shading. It's just what's happening here. Now, the most important part, as we see it, is the area where I'm going to cross out at the very end of this. And we're going to find out if that bleeds through. Looking at the broad nib, it's darker than the medium. It feathers, it spreads, it doesn't shade. It looks like I was writing with a marker, to be quite honest. Looking at the back of the page, it did bleed through where I crossed that word out, and it put a line down underneath on the next page, making, depending on your tolerance for it, usable or not. Now, we have a normal amount of ghosting, which isn't really a big deal, and the fact that some of these other spots in the regular writing did not bleed through are to this ink's benefit. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? So, a bluish undertone can show through if you're using a drier, broad pen, and depending on the paper. Now, we did see it once with a fine pen, and while the undertones didn't really show up so much during the writing samples, I did experience them just a little bit while I was using the ink up from those pens. And I don't like that. I don't want that blue undertone coming through. I like it best from a medium to dry flow fine pen because there I get a great neutral gray with good shading and tremendous tone variation from one pen to the other. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.